Disruptive innovations begin on the margins and don't penetrate the mainstream until their quality is proven to be as good, if not better, than more established models. Disruptive innovation is a term that was coined by Clayton Christensen and his colleagues back in the 1990s, and its effects have been seen in many sectors over the years, including in education. Our guest today is Michael Horn, chairman, co-founder, and a distinguished fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute in Massachusetts. And he worked closely with Christensen over the years. He has written several books on disruptive innovation and education, and his latest book, From Reopen to Reinvent, Recreating School for Every Child, was just released this summer. Michael serves as an executive editor at Education Next and is a venture partner at NextGen Venture Partners. Michael was selected as a 2014 Eisenhower Fellow to study innovation in education in Vietnam and Korea, and Tech and Learning magazine named him to its list of the 100 most important people in the creation and advancement of the use of technology in education. Michael holds a BA in history from Yale University and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Michael Horn, welcome to the LiberatED podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, and hope you don't hold the degrees against me.
It's great to have you here. I've been following your writing and your work for quite a while. I also follow you on social media. It's always great to see what you're writing about, what you're thinking about. You definitely have this sort of futurist view of education, and then are able to take some of that vision and use that to help create kind of practical strategies and suggestions for educators and administrators in today's schools. And so I want to talk a lot about your new book and some of the strategies and successes that you might see there. But first, let's back up and talk about the larger concept of disruptive innovation, which is what the Clayton Christensen Institute, which you co-founded, is known for, and what much of your writing focuses on, including your earlier books. So what is disruptive innovation, and what does it look like in the context of education?
Yeah, so I think you did a good job up front of framing it, which is that in sectors that are characterized by things that are complicated, expensive, centralized, inaccessible, disruptive innovation really is the causal mechanism, if you will, behind creative destruction. It's this force that unleashes new opportunities that are more affordable, more convenient, more accessible, simpler to use, that initially don't look as good as the mainstream, but powered by some sort of technology enabler, they get better and better and better, so that, before you had to do the complicated problems or most complex tasks, perhaps in the old line innovation, the disruption starts to be able to do these things, and people flock out to it because they're delighted by something that's more affordable, convenient, accessible, and simple. And that's how transformation typically occurs in the economy in sector after sector. So if you turn to education, what's interesting, I would say it's easier to talk about it in terms of higher ed, where we've seen disruption in terms of online degrees or short form boot camp programs start to emerge that have really started to displace professional master's degrees, on ground brick and mortar college campuses and things of that nature. In K-12 education in the US, it's a little trickier to figure out because we don't have these pockets historically of places where the alternative is nothing at all. If you go to the developing world, you see low-cost private schools, for example, in India, just booming. It's a classic case of disruption, right? And we kind of crowd that out in the US context. I think the two places where we sort of see it are, one, in the disruption of the classroom within schools. So using online learning to provide courses that you couldn't otherwise offer in rural environments and urban environments for advanced courses, things like that. Or frankly, this phenomenon of micro schools, not for people who are unserved by traditional schools, but I would argue for people who are overserved. They don't need all of the hand-holding and services. They want the customized version of school for themselves that's far lower cost, convenient, accessible, and suits the progress that they're trying to make in their lives.
So, Michael, you mentioned the low-cost private schools in India. James Tooley, in his classic book, The Beautiful Tree, wrote about these schools, as well as in the African continent and parts of Asia, China in particular. And so that makes me wonder, is disruptive innovation, does it have to be catalyzed by technology? I mean, it seems like most of the recent innovations would certainly be technology enabled, but these low cost private schools in India and elsewhere are presumably not relying heavily on technology. They're just doing something a little bit different. And even though there may be widely available and free public schools, parents are instead choosing these low-cost private schools. In many cases, these are extremely poor families, but they see the value of these private schools and prefer them over the local public schools. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about disruptive innovation. Is it only tech-enabled?
Yeah, I love the question because it gives me permission to geek out a little bit on this topic. And initially, we thought it could be any low cost innovation. What we observed over time was that you actually did need some sort of technology enabler that allowed you to carry that low in terms of like the original value proposition around convenience, affordability, and accessibility, and allow you to improve without just replicating all the cost features of the incumbent. And so the classic example that we like to give is hotels. You know, Motel 6, Holiday Inn, places like that came in at quote unquote the low end. Disruptive innovation theory would have predicted that they would have displaced Marriott and Four Seasons, but they didn't. They just hung out at the low end and never really got better. And then along comes Airbnb, starts with couch surfing, and the technology enabler of unleashing all these things that they didn't own dramatically changes, right, the hoteling industry. And so what's interesting about the low cost private schools that Thule wrote about, you're right, technically they're not a disruptive innovation. I would call them more a decentralization. But what's interesting now is we see organizations like Lead School in India powering these low cost private schools, helping them get better and better and better. The outcomes are dramatically better than the traditional public schools, which, by the way, with all the books and fees that they sneak in there, often cost more than these low-cost private schools, as Thule documented. And so they truly are, I think, starting to disrupt. And I'm on the board of a nonprofit called Imagine Worldwide that works in Africa. We're using technology to basically, where there's no school or 200-to-1 student-teacher ratios, to empower kids to direct their own learning, to learn how to become literate and numerate. So I kind of think the low-cost private schools identified the opportunity. The technology is going to take it the next step and make it truly disruptive.
So I wonder, in the context of some of these emerging learning models or educational models that might have been on the margins and have now come into the mainstream, are examples of this disruptive innovation using kind of the classic definition of technology enabled. I think, for example, of the microschool movement, which of course was gaining traction pre-2020, but has really taken off since then. And of course, we had sort of models of that, even dating back into the kind of the late 20th century. We had the kind of emergence of hybrid schools that homeschoolers would take advantage of in the beginning in the 1990s, where they'd go to a building a couple of days a week and the rest of the time was at home. That's gained in popularity since. And then, of course, homeschooling, which kind of began its modern ascent in the late 1960s and early 1970s and has exploded in popularity in recent years. And again, that might also be because of technology. If we think of now the microschools, especially the fast growing networks of microschools, like, for example, Prenda or the new startup KaiPod Learning, they are leveraging technology to be able to scale while still kind of creating that one-room schoolhouse feel. And then similarly with homeschooling, now, you're able to access global teachers and classes, and so it makes it much easier to be able to kind of disconnect schooling from a conventional classroom and imagine other ways of learning. Is that right? I mean, are those kind of appropriate applications of the definition of disruptive innovation?
Literally 1,000% in my book, right? That these are basically families, and this is the funny thing about disruptive innovation: it's either unserved or it's overserved, right? Is for whom disruption starts. And I would argue, Prenda Learning is a classic case. Like, those families are saying, I don't need all the services, the lunches, the full suite of things, or the hybrid homeschoolers, right? I don't want to go to your school 5 days a week. I don't want all of the things that you're teaching. I want to be able to have some customization. I want a simple model that works for the needs of me and my family. And, they could look at a private school. Those tend to be pretty expensive. This is like a really nice sweet spot. Leveraging technology allows you to stay connected to the curriculum, learn from anywhere, learn from the best experts anywhere, tremendous opportunities, and then basically surround the child with a variety of novel supports that are customized to what that child needs, what the family needs, and unleash all sorts of things. And I'd even go a step further. Like, you think about, you've interviewed folks who are doing like forest school micro schools and things like that. My kids did some of that as well. What's really interesting is I think technology is going to actually, in a way that's probably anathema to some people that started forest schools, going to make it way more accessible to people, because now I can have that learning experience that comes from being in an outdoor environment, which is amazing. But by the way, I can also connect through OutSchool or Khan Academy or YouTube or whatever, some basic lessons, get connected to some teachers for some things that maybe I can't get in that environment. All of a sudden it makes these options so much more accessible to so many more families from so many more walks of life. And I won't forget, Carrie, a parent who I was talking to her a few months ago, Black mother in Detroit, and she was helping a lot of families do these homeschooling experiences. And I said, can all these families sort of do that? Because I think a lot of us make unfair assumptions around income level and the ability to jump on these. And she said, Michael, 16% of Detroit students can read proficiently. We can do a heck of a lot better with snapping these resources together. And I am enabling it with and enabling all these families to jump on board. That's the movement I think we're starting to see.
So let's talk a little bit more then about that movement. Your newest book came out in July, called From Reopen to Reinvent. And it really is a response to the pandemic response and the major disruption that had on education with school closures and ongoing policies and just overall turmoil for a lot of families and educators. And you wanted to sort of help educators, particularly those, it seems like, working in traditional environments, to say, rather than just kind of going back to normal pre-pandemic, what are the sort of lessons learned from the school closures and remote learning that maybe were useful, valuable? How can you kind of continue to innovate and use this disruption to your advantage in terms of making teaching and learning more effective? I wonder if you can talk about when and why you decided to write this book.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The book really came out of a podcast that Diane Tavner, who leads Summit Public Schools, a network of charter schools in California and Washington, she and I started this podcast called Class Disrupted together during the pandemic. And it was because parents were reaching out to both of us saying, like, why is my kid getting all these worksheets? Or like, why does school only take 2 hours now and we have all this extra time? What the heck was going on for the other 4 hours when they were in the school building historically? And all these sorts of questions. And we basically use the podcast as an excuse to peel back the curtain on schooling and say, like, it doesn't have to operate this way. There are far better ways to have schooling experiences for kids. And frankly, that collection of insights grew into a deeper a second season and a third season of the podcast and a bunch of writing from me. And to be totally honest, like, I then got distressed at how many schools were falling back to normal. And for me, it was like, I really wanted to put it all in one place and be like, hey, you don't need to do this. You have some agency, just like the parents who are making choices. You too have some agency to do things differently. And it sort of puts it all in one place of, like, I guess my frustrations, my hopes, but also some techniques that I hope parents and educators can use to pull their community to create something that is more centered around each student as opposed to the system.
Yeah, so some of the innovations that you talk about or that you suggest schools can consider would be creating micro schools within a school. If it's working in the larger culture, if it's something that parents are clamoring for. smaller, kind of more personalized learning environments. Why not try that in a conventional school? And I guess that's where I'd like to kind of probe a little bit further, to see, is that really possible? I mean, you talk about the Summit schools throughout your book. Summit is, of course, a network of charter schools, which tend to have a little bit more autonomy, or privately run. And you could see some of these innovations being able to occur with organizations that have a bit more autonomy, potentially, that maybe have less bureaucracy. Certainly the microschool movement outside of district schools, that we're seeing quite a bit of innovation in. So, I guess, is it possible that these schools could innovate? And if they're able to, is it sustainable? And I'll just say one other thing about that. In my Unschooled book, I use examples from the 1960s and 1970s, especially at a time when there was a lot of innovation in education. There was the free school movement and the open classroom movement, and there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm. I think of the Philadelphia Parkway program that the New York Times called the most interesting high school in America. It was this school without walls, and kids would be immersed in their city and taking hands-on apprenticeships and internships. And then a few years later, as sort of the buzz around open classrooms and free schooling faded, Philadelphia Parkway got reabsorbed into the larger school district. And we've seen that with so many other examples. So I just wonder about, what do you think of in terms of the sustainability of these innovations if a school is able to launch some of these recommendations? Or do you see potentially more success outside of district schools?
Yeah, look, the theory of disruptive innovation is pretty clear, right? There's going to be more success outside of the traditional system. And the further you can escape the gravitational pull of the traditional system, the more success at reinventing the value proposition you're going to have. Full stop. It's just reality. At the same time, districts are where the majority of kids still are. And it is where they have the majority of resources. And what we've also learned from disruptive innovation theory is that if organizations take what we call a dual transformation approach, where yes, they continue to do what they've done in the old and improve it, but also start to create these autonomous zones where they can innovate, then you can start to make these leaps. And they have a lot of the advantages that these startups don't. And so rather than use them to shut out the innovation that I think is so critical right now for everyone, I wish they would use it to actually embrace and further the innovation and see if they can race some of these micro schools to do it even better. I think for all the reasons you cited, we should be skeptical. I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but I do think it's possible. And I do think that there are some districts that have done a pretty good job of it and held on for multiple years of doing it on, so that it suggests maybe they have some escape velocity that will be sticky and stay in that community. It is not a guarantee for a lot of reasons. And from my perspective, the biggest thing for it to be possible is that districts have to lose their one-size-fits-all mindset around how schooling works and the services that they provision and provide. And if they don't, and the community doesn't, there's no way they're going to get escape velocity. And we can predict right now, all the action is going to come from outside.
Well, and it's possible too that district schools might be feeling some competitive pressure, as so many students have left district schools for other options, including homeschooling, private schools, parochial schools, homeschooling. I mentioned that, but just all these other available options, micro schools, pods. So that conventional schools might be feeling like, well, we have to do something to recruit and retain our students and keep our parents satisfied. Are there examples of some of these districts that you think are doing it well? What is it about them that is making them, what you think, sticky? Why do you think that they'll succeed?
Yeah. So, well, firstly, I think your point about the competitive pressure is an important one, because the studies that I read of, districts where there's a heavy preponderance of charters in their community, the districts start to get better because they need to hold on to parents. It's once parents realize that they have a choice and they start acting like consumers, which I think may be the biggest contribution of the pandemic, is that more parents see themselves as active consumers, not passive recipients of their school. it will force change. And whether that systemic change comes from people migrating to options outside, or whether it's some hybrid of that plus districts evolving, I think if you want to have an optimistic spin, that's where it is. To your question of like where has done it well, I'd point to Lindsay Unified School District, which I talk about in the book, which has really undergone a remarkable transformation over a couple decades now, where they started. The story that I tell in the book is of the high school grad who couldn't even read a newspaper in front of the school principal with his father, and they've moved to one where they have embraced personalized learning, they have embraced mastery-based. And then they've really empowered the educators on the ground in their individual schools to say, what's the right way to make sure we're seeing that growth of each and every child, and had a very performance mindset around that. And the numbers, both conventional as well as sort of engagement numbers that we often don't think about in terms of school performance, have all gone up dramatically in the right direction in a district like that. And they've sustained it over a couple decades. So there are these examples of schools and districts that escape that gravitational pull and seem to have some stickiness to it. Jury's out though, right? School boards can change, things can change rather fast. And I'll just say on this, podcast, one of the big case studies I use in the book is Kettle Moraine, which, as I understand it, has actually had a big reversal in the last 6 months from when I finished writing. They leveraged a lot of micro schools and charter schools that they created to create a variety of options. But what's interesting is that I would argue the book sort of predicted the reasons that they had a demise, which is that they started making some changes where they mandated it for all families. They didn't give families the choice to opt in. And once you started imposing it on certain families, some of them said, I don't want this. Hey, wait a minute, what's all this other stuff going on? And they started to overthrow it very predictably. And it's funny, Carrie, because like people in education often act surprised at this. Like you're selling, it's like as though Apple and Tim Cook got up there and said, we've built this awesome iPod or iPhone. It's for Carrie, it's not for Michael, but Michael, you should buy it too. And you should love it, even though it's not at all built for your situation. You would never do that. And so I think innovating with and seeing these parents and students as wanting to pull these things into their lives is really important. So in many ways, the book, I think, actually does a pretty good job of explaining why there's been some retreat in one of its central case studies.
Yeah, with one of the main outcomes, of course, of the past couple of years of disruption has been parent empowerment and their demand of more choice and more options. So lesson learned that when you add this kind of coercion or mandates on parents, they will resist. And that's, certainly a cautionary tale for other districts to consider. So, in addition to being an author and to your involvement with the Clayton Christensen Institute, you are also a venture partner at NextGen Venture Partners, which is a venture capital firm that invests in both early stage and growth stage companies in many sectors, including ed tech companies and virtual charter school startups. What are you seeing as some of the most exciting trends in the education startup world?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, like Kipod Learning and Prenda, and we have a company, Michael Staten, who's the entrepreneur, that is really doing a virtual charter, but is really actually well suited for homeschoolers as well. There's just some really neat energy around the whole schooling solution, for lack of a better phrase, where we give you a lot of choice and customization within what that looks like. But it's not just these one-off tools like learn how to read better, which are important. But I would say the previous decade was marked by a lot of innovation around math or reading or sort of this specific skill or knowledge. I'm really energized by the entrepreneurs that are thinking very creatively about how do you remix the schooling experience right now for families. And some of that, like My Tech High is another one that both goes direct to families, but also partners with districts, and frankly, might be the thing that powers and keeps some of these pods and micro schools within districts more sustainable over the long run. Like stay tuned, right, to see what that looks like. Just this wave of energy, though, that doesn't accept the status quo as the way things have to operate, or that I have to fit within the conventional classroom box. has me pretty energized about the current wave of entrepreneurs.
I'm very energized. I think that this expanded supply of education options that entrepreneurs are helping to catalyze is really going to create a much more diverse ecosystem of education options for families, as well as more cost-effective options, that there will be these low-cost models or potentially tuition-free models like Co-Learn that you mentioned Michael Staten's creating as a virtual charter school homeschool initiative. So, I wonder, what are some of the barriers that you see for education entrepreneurs today? Because it is a highly regulated sector. It's not easy to open a school or a micro school. There are regulatory barriers to entry and scale. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges for today's education entrepreneurs and potential solutions?
Yeah, so I think the first one is funding, obviously, and it's on two fronts, right? One is, frankly, the venture capital model, I think, is a poor fit for a lot of these education entrepreneurs, because I think the type of growth that you see in education is not the same as, say, a thin layer of Facebook or Google. Like, the analogy for scale, I think, should be less software and more like civil engineering, right? Like, we take these principles and they scale, but each local instance is going to, the building in one town is going to look very different from a building in another town, even if the same principles undergird their architecture. And so I think we need to have more funding sources that are fit for that type of model, as opposed to the, build one version of it, copy paste a billion times, and you've scaled, Facebook. So that's the first one. Obviously, the second one is more funding models that don't crowd out these innovations. Again, when people have the choice between free or something low cost, that creates stress in a lot of people's lives. And so I'm encouraged by actions in Arizona around the education savings accounts. I'd like to see more innovation in that part. And I think there's people who are thinking creatively right now about that. I think the third one, frankly, is more of a local regulation, which is around zoning. I think we need to think much more expansively about, quote unquote, what school is and where does it need to occur, and realize that learning is in the life of a young child. It's occurring constantly. Every experience is contributing something. And so that means that school can happen in a lot of different environments with a lot of different structures of who your educators are and how you structure that. And so zoning and some of those rules around who is a teacher and things of that nature, I think we really need to pull back on. In general, I'd say, the more we can free up on the inputs of how and where schools, the processes and the resources, the better off we'll be. But I think those are the big barriers that a lot of these players are confronting right now.
I think it's really interesting you brought up zoning. I conducted focus groups with dozens of education entrepreneurs this year, looking at what are some of their policy barriers, what are some challenges to entry and scale in the education marketplace, and have a new policy paper that'll be coming out soon, kind of highlighting some of these key barriers as well as potential policy solutions. And zoning was the top concern that I heard from education entrepreneurs for all of the reasons that you mentioned. Often if someone wants to open a micro school, for example, they get thrust into less desirable commercial space that's often on a busy street, or it has no outdoor space, so it's not necessarily conducive to a good educational setting, or they just have a really difficult time finding a spot that would be accepting of and appropriate for children. So I think there's a lot to be done there, a lot of kind of creative solutions at the state and local levels. The New York Times recently had an article about all of these half-empty suburban office parks now that people have moved toward virtual work or hybrid work schedules, and thinking about how do we repurpose some of these suburban office parks. So creating some education innovation hubs there and encouraging micro schools to open there and so on could be a way around some of these zoning challenges.
Yeah, and one of the coolest innovations I saw pre-pandemic was this group called, I think it's Workspace in Connecticut. And it was basically a co-working space for adults where they could work and their kids were taking customized schooling options. I think there was an Acton Academy, which is a great network of micro schools. I believe there was like various virtual school courses and homeschooling options, or an array of stuff. And I thought, how cool is that for the parents to have a place for their kids to go, but be plugged in alongside them in effect. And then for the students to be alongside working professionals and getting to see real projects and meetings and things of that nature. I think the suburban office park speaks to that as well. There may be, 50% capacity now, but how cool would it be if there's a group of 5 kids even going in there? Maybe it's a biotech firm where I live in Lexington, and like being alongside people as they're actually doing the work and figuring out ways to merge that together. I just think there's so many opportunities if we can pull back some of these regulations.
I completely agree. And I'm so glad you brought up Workspace and Kath Fraze, the founder of Workspace, and her visionary work in education. Now she's working on creating a workspace in the metaverse that's going quite well.
Cool.
So yeah, she's definitely leading the charge there in terms of reimagining the ways in which we kind of co-work and co-learn. And so that, I guess, leads me to one of my kind of final questions for you, Michael, and that is, what do you think is the future of education? It's sort of a big question, but you seem to have your finger on the pulse of educational trends and potential innovations. And I wonder what you think education will look like in the next, say, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm known often for making big predictions, and I've been reticent though during this time to do so because I just wasn't sure how quickly habits would snap back. I think what's really interesting, and I will answer the question, I won't duck it, is one of our big theories is also jobs to be done. Like, why do people hire a certain product or service? What's the struggling moment in their lives, and what progress are they trying to make? And part of jobs to be done is understanding that there's pushes acting on you and pulls that are causing you to look for something new. But what's holding you back historically is these anxieties about that new solution and then habits of the present. And I think what's so interesting about the pandemic is that for so many parents and families, it basically reduced that habit of the present to almost nothing. And it eliminated a lot of friction in the system, which I think actually, I was wondering, would that snap back the moment the habit returned? I think it's not. And I think that's actually really exciting if you think 5, 10 years from now, because I think it'll be a lot more parents consciously acting as education consumers so that we don't just have a supply of a lot more schooling options, like you mentioned, but also greater demand. And I think that'll create a more vibrant market, in effect, of people actively trying to figure out, hey, how do I help my child make progress in their current situation? And I think historically, a lot of parents have been set it and forget it parents when it comes to schooling. I think a lot more are going to act like, dare I say, me and my wife, where every year we're having a conversation to reevaluate what's right now for our child, given how they have developed over the year and given where we are as a family. And that's, I think in the future, we're going to be having a lot more conversations of that nature. And I'll just say one other thing. There's a lot of friction right now and concern around mobile phones and smartphones and what it's done for teens and mental health and so forth. But I also think it's going to unlock a lot of learning opportunities for those same individuals and make a lot of the things we've talked about today even more accessible to more people. So there's going to be some dangers to navigate, but I think there's, from an entrepreneurship perspective, there's going to be some really exciting things that unleashes. And I don't know where that'll go, but I think it's going to allow for more customization in how we learn.
Yeah, so the growing impact of mobile technology on education, maybe we haven't yet seen the tip of the iceberg there. So that's exciting to think about. So the book is called Reopen to Reinvent, Recreating School for Every Child. It's available wherever books are sold. How else can my listeners connect with you, Michael?
Yeah, so Twitter at Michael B. Horn, my website, michaelbhorn.com, or my Substack, The Future of Education. Just search that in Michael B. Horn, and you can. Those are probably the best avenues to keep up with all things me, except for hanging out on social media where I'm following you, I guess.
Michael Horn, thank you again for being on the LiberatED podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.